I don't have heroes. Heroes is a big word. There are people that I look up to and I've learned a lot from. And Matt Ridley has got to be near the top of that list. And most recently, Matt wrote a great book called How Innovation Works, which will be out by the time this podcast is out there. This has been your most impactful book for me since Geno. It was very revealing. If you're an entrepreneur in Silicon Valley, Shanghai, or Bangalore, and you're thinking about creating products, whether it's social media, launching rockets, building airplanes, or genetic engineering, you need to read this book because it will give you a better view of the history of innovation as well as the future of innovation than any other book that I know of. That context will be incredibly important when you're trying to figure out things like, do I file patents? How important is the role of science? How important is the role of government? How long will it take for my innovation to be adopted? How much can I expect to sink into legal battles versus explaining things to people versus building the product? There's conversation that goes on over and over about almost everything in history, which is history the product of a few great men and women, a few great accomplishments, a few great moments, a few great battles, a few great inventions that happen to come along? Or is it an inevitable, inexorable, and evolved process? You conclusively lay out lots of evidence that innovation is an evolutionary process rather than invention process. And actually, you call it innovation rather than invention. That seems a deliberate choice. Tell me about that choice.
I try and draw a distinction between invention and innovation. It's not a distinction that is cast in iron, but I think this is the best way to think about it. Invention is the coming out with a prototype of a new device or a new social practice. Innovation is the business of turning a new device into something practical, affordable, and reliable that people want to use and acquire. It's the process of driving down the price. It's the process of driving up the reliability and the efficiency of the device. And it's the process of persuading other people to adopt it too. It's Thomas Edison captures this point very well. I don't think he used the word innovation much. He used the word invention, but he is mainly an innovator because he's not necessarily coming up with original ideas. He's taking other people's ideas and turning them into practical propositions. It was he who said that this is a process of 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. What I'm trying to do in this book is rescue the perspirators from obscurity and slightly relegate the inspirators, who always think they deserve the most credit and who sometimes complain about not getting enough reward because it's their original idea. I like to tell the story which Charles Townes used to tell, the inventor of the laser, of a rabbit and a beaver looking at the Hoover Dam, and the beaver is saying to the rabbit, "No, I didn't build it, but it's based on an idea of mine." That is how inventors quite often think about innovation. Come on, I had the idea. It's a huge amount of work and talent to turn an idea into something practical.
This is something that you'll learn in Silicon Valley very early on, that ideas are a dime a dozen. Every idea has been floating around. Even a lot of the old ideas that failed weren't necessarily bad ideas, they were just the wrong time. Frankly, if you're an entrepreneur, self-styled inventor, or this is probably the cheapest, fastest education you can get on the history and future of innovation. So I highly recommend it. I'm going to leave with a quote that I liked from the book that summarizes what innovation is, where it's fostered, and it has a very optimistic and a correct view of how it operates. That quote is, "Innovation is the child of freedom because it is a free and creative attempt to satisfy freely expressed human desires." That's a powerful quote for me. It tells me that innovation requires freedom, it's creative, and we're satisfying what people want to do as opposed to what they're told or forced to do. I also read his book, The Rational Optimist, which helped me realize that it was rational to be optimistic because of the technological advancement, the scientific advancement that we've had as a human species since we first came across fire, the stone axe, and basic tools.
Let's do this last tweet. You said, don't partner with cynics and pessimists. Their beliefs are self-fulfilling.
Yeah, essentially, to create things, you have to be a rational optimist. Rational in the sense that you have to see the world for what it really is, and yet you have to be optimistic about your own capabilities and your capability to get things done. We all know people who are consistently pessimistic, who will shoot down everything. Everyone in their life has like the helpful, critical guy, right? He thinks he's being helpful, but he's actually being critical, and he's a downer on everything. That person will not only never do anything great in their lives, they'll prevent other people around them from doing something great. They think their job is to shoot holes in things. And it's okay to shoot holes in things as long as you come up with a solution. There's also the classic military line, either lead, follow, or get out of the way. And these people want a fourth option where they don't want to lead, they don't want to follow, but they don't want to get out of the way. They want to tell you why the thing's not going to work. And all the really successful people I know have a very strong action bias. They just do things. The easiest way to figure out if something's viable or not is by doing it. At least do the first step and the second step and the third, and then decide. So if you want to be successful in life, creating wealth or having good relationships or being fit or even being happy, you need to have an action bias towards getting what you want. And you have to be optimistic about it, not irrationally. There's nothing worse than someone who's just foolhardy and chasing it's not work. That's why I say rational optimist. But you have to be rational, know all the pitfalls, know the downsides, but still keep your chin up. I mean, you've got one life on this planet. Why not try to build something big? This is the beauty of Elon Musk and why I think he inspires so many people. It's just because he takes on really, really big, audacious tasks, and he provides an example for people to think big. And it takes a lot of work to build even small things. I don't think the corner grocery store owner is working any less hard than Elon Musk or pouring any less sweat and toil into it, maybe even more. But for whatever reason, education, circumstance, they didn't get the chance to think as big, so the outcome's not as big. So it's just better to think big, obviously rationally within your means, stay optimistic. The cynics and the pessimists, what they're really saying, and fortunate, but they're saying, I've given up. I don't think I can do anything. And so the world to me just looks like a world where nobody can do anything. And so why should you go do something? Because if you fail, then I'm right, which is great. But if you succeed, then you just make me look bad.
I normally don't travel for conferences, but when I got the opportunity to speak with Nassim, I had to come down from San Francisco. To me, he is one of the very, very few living natural philosophers, which is someone who practices science, does real work in science, but outside of a scientific institution, outside of the credential system. And I think his work is the kind of work that will last for 1,000 years. I don't say that lightly, but I think people will be reading. There are books that Nassim has written, and I won't insult him by calling him Dr. Taleb. Is that okay? I'll just call you.
Yeah, it is an insult to
Yeah. So I won't insult you by calling you Dr. Taleb, but Nassim has written books that I think people will be reading 1,000 years from now. His new book, Skin in the Game, is fantastic. It's part 5 in his Incerto series, which includes Fooled by Randomness, Black Swan, Anti-Fragile, The Bed of Procrustes. It's written in a very timeless way. The concepts are very simple. There's not a lot of math to it, although there is a huge math backing to the Incerto if you want to get into it. And I would rather reread his work than anything on the bestseller lists, and I have. Many of his books I've reread. If you haven't read all 5 of his books, I wouldn't read anything else this year. I would literally just absorb them, and I don't say that lightly. That's true for me. Like, I'm going through Skin in the Game.
He's going to convince me to try to read my books now.
Yeah, they're amazing.
The first one was finished 20 years ago, so you got to understand that I'm.
Well, there is some redundancy in there, as you would expect, and I think a common theme that Nassim pointed out to me when we talked earlier, running through the whole thing, is this concept of symmetry and asymmetry. Skin in the Game is about symmetry between your consequences of your actions and learning and feedback loops, and asymmetry is about extreme outcomes. So, Black Swan and those kinds of principles. Why don't you explain symmetry and asymmetry in your work?
So you don't understand random events. You can't predict what can happen, but you can pretty much tell how the random event would hit you. No. You know whether you're going to make from it, lose from it, make a lot, lose a lot. Okay, so you try to position yourself in a way to benefit more than you would lose from a random event, okay, or to lose less than your neighbor from a random event. That's the idea of asymmetry. It's pretty much like an option, what I call an option. An option, you make more on the upside than you would on the downside. And if you, in general, make more from a random event than you lose from it, then you're going to do very well in the long run, provided you make sure you're going to survive. That's the asymmetry that's present in contracts and options, stuff like that. That asymmetry becomes bad when you make the upside like Bob Rubin and transfer the downside to someone else. And the easiest thing to transfer to, a person to transfer to, the taxpayer, the anonymous taxpayer, you see? So that is an asymmetry, okay? A bad asymmetry. But tinkering, trial and error, has a really positive asymmetry. So the simple example I would give is, if we wanted, what's your favorite dish?
It's pizza, but I shouldn't be eating it.
Pizza what?
But I shouldn't be eating it.
Okay, so pizza. Okay, so let's say we decide to make the best pizza. They would call it the Santa Monica Flying Pizza. All right, here. So you rent a bus. You go to the local university and bring every chemist. Round up every chemist you can find. Okay, and you take another bus and round up every overweight person you can find in L.A. who's well dressed. This is my metric when you go to a restaurant: is to look at for overweight people who are well dressed. Okay, that's sort of like my thing. So you have two crowds now. Okay, so if we ask a chemist, that's a top down, okay, to invent that pizza. You ask a chemist, you have about 150 chemists, all looking boring and poorly fed and visibly not well dressed, and then you ask the well-dressed people, whatever, and overweight, you tell them, listen, let's make the best pizza. So the way you do it is you take an existing recipe and you start adding ingredients to it, no? And you taste. If it's good, you ratchet up. Okay, so you have the upside. If it's good, you discover something that really has good taste, you go up, all right, you ratchet up. In other words, you lock up your gain, okay? No. If it's bad, you give it to a chemist. Have very little to lose, all right? So that is trial and error, a lot of trial and error. And I showed an anti-fragile, and that's the main argument, that trial and error will always outperform design. Simply because of that property, that we're vastly more intelligent. We have an IQ of 1,000 when we do trial and error.
I was very pleasantly surprised a couple of years back that I reopened an old book, which I had read, or I thought I'd read about a decade ago, called The Beginning of Infinity by David Deutsch. Sometimes you read a book and it makes a difference right away. Sometimes you read a book and you don't understand it, then you read it later at the right time and it makes a difference. This time, when I reopened this book and I went through it much more carefully than I had in the past, meticulously, rather than reading it to read it and to say I was done reading it, I read it to understand the concepts and the topics and stopped at every point where something was new. It completely started reforming my worldview. It changed the way I think, and I would credit this book as being probably the only book in the last decade, except maybe a few of Nassim Taleb's works and maybe one or two other scattered, books that I feel made me smarter. They literally expanded the way that I think. They expanded not just the repertoire of my knowledge, but the repertoire of my reasoning. People throw around words like mental models a lot, and I find most mental models not worth reading or thinking about or listening to because I find them trivial. However, the mental models that came out of the beginning of Infinity are transformational because they very convincingly completely changed the way that you look at what is true and what is not. Karl Popper laid out the theory of what is scientific and what is not. What is a good explanation, what is not. And what Deutsch does is he expands on that dramatically in the beginning of Infinity. But even that is to do it a disservice. The wide-ranging nature of what he covers in the beginning of Infinity is incredible. He goes from the theory of knowledge, which goes by the fancy word epistemology, all the way to quantum mechanics and physics and multiverse theory, to infinity and mathematics, to the reach of what is noble and what is not noble, universal explanations, the theory of computation, what is beauty, what systems of politics work better, how to raise your children. These are all encompassing long-range philosophical ideas.
Reflections. Let me now share with you two of my favorite quotes from Naval Ravikant on this topic of reading. The first one is, "Read what you love until you love to read." And the second quote is, "Read enough and you become a connoisseur. Then you naturally gravitate more towards theory, concepts, and nonfiction." Now I'll leave you with an insightful observation from the philosopher John Stuart Mill on why most people will prefer to be pessimists rather than optimists. "I've observed that not the man who hopes when others despair, but the man who despairs when others hope, is admired by a large class of persons as a sage."
So that's all for today's nuggets, and if you also want to get the best nuggets from books, I recommend you to check out Shortform, which is a platform that I personally love using because I can learn from many books in a super efficient way. Shortform is not sponsoring this video, but I do have an affiliate link, which is shortform.com/pickingnuggets. You can also find it below in the description, and you can use it to get a 5-day free trial and a 20% discount on the annual subscription.